The two-week-long climate summit is expected to host over 160 world leaders, government ministers, and other technical experts from about 200 countries will engage in negotiations. About 70,000 delegates are expected to participate. And according to Belize's chief negotiator, Ambassador Carlos Fuller, negotiations will be intense.
Absolutely intense. In fact, it's going to be so intense that even while the leaders are speaking, we'll be negotiating. So it's not as if we're going to be waiting for them to continue. So they will be speaking in one part of the COP, and we'll be doing the work on the ground in another part.
Belize is part of the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, the Association of Small Island Developing States, AOSIS, and a group of 7 plus China. Unlike many other small island developing states, Belize is focused on key issues such as loss and damage, specifically operationalizing the fund.
So, in fact, part of the decisions coming out is to put aside a certain amount of the funding towards small island developing states and least developed countries, because we recognize those are the ones most impacted. So the idea is that large countries would not absorb all the money, but a certain amount of that funds is actually put aside for us. It seems very good at this stage. The transitional committee that was established to develop the fund finalized its work, and we believe that the bodies, the COP, will adopt that without touching any word within the recommendations coming out of the Transitional Committee. If that is the case, then we begin right away working on it, and it is done then to capitalize it. And I understand a few countries have already said they will be putting money into the fund right away.
So the Loss and Damage Fund was approved and launched today at COP28. Both the United Arab Emirates and Germany pledged $100 million each. The European Union promised $275 million. The United States, $17.5 million, and Japan promised $10 million. The establishment of the fund has long been a pressing demand from developing nations at the forefront of climate change.
Well, we know that climate change is a risk multiplier. The Caribbean is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world, and people are being impacted significantly by the effects of climate change. In terms of loss and damage, in Belize, for example, we lose 7% of our equivalent of GDP every year without a hurricane from climate-related disasters. In Dominica, we would have lost 226% of GDP from Hurricane Maria. In the Bahamas, about 50% of their debt is directly linked to hurricanes over the last 10 years. So we suffer the consequences of loss and damages resulting from hurricane. And so the fight of the Caribbean for 30 years to have this fund, to provide money that will assist the countries in terms of recovering and recovery after loss and damage, is what's at stake here.
The framework involves reparations that rich nations accountable for industrial activities leading to global warming and the resulting climate crisis are mandated to pay for what they continue to cause. The Caribbean is one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change. This region emits less than 1% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, but countries like Belize continue to be significantly affected. The far-reaching consequences of climate change extend to impacting lives, livelihoods, biodiversity, cultural customs, and identities. The executive director of the 5Cs, Dr. Colin Young, says specific details will need to be ironed out to determine how exactly the fund will operate.
That's part of what needs to be decided, and what is going to be the trigger. Some countries are proposing that we have a trigger of about 5% of GDP once a disaster causes losses and damages equivalent to 5% or more of GDP, it triggers a payout. But obviously, we would have to look at how do you cap it, because if you have a major disaster like what happened in Pakistan, where you're looking at about $40 billion in damages, such a disaster can easily exhaust all of the monies in the fund. So those are the kind of rules that will need to be set up. But the one thing that is very clear, and that you would hear the prime ministers of the region and the heads of governments of the region advocate for, is that whatever it is, it needs to be simple and it needs to be efficient without sacrificing transparency. But we cannot wait for 2 years or 3 years to get monies from this fund after a disaster. We need it within weeks or months.
An independent board will be created to manage the fund. Research shows that 55 vulnerable countries have suffered more than $525 billion in climate crisis fuel losses in the last 20 years, and that figure is growing. It should be noted, though, that loss and damage fund is different from humanitarian assistance.
So, for example, a country is affected by a hurricane. Of course, you would get the Red Cross. Countries pledge to come in and support you. Put your communities back on track and so on. It is the rebuilding part that would then go on the loss and damage. You say, okay, and I'll give you an example. After Hurricane Hattie, you got immediate response for people who were affected, and you put in people in homes and so on. But the long-term thing was Benwapan. That to me is how a loss and damage fund would think. So how do you go to the next stage so that if it comes again, you are better prepared for the next one?
But having an empty bucket with no money in it is half of the success. So we want, as a region, to see substantial amount of money put into this fund at this COP. Now that is left to be seen as to whether the developed countries will put substantial amount of monies. Obviously, the loss and damages from climate-related disasters are in the hundreds of billions across all developing countries. So we're not going to get $1 billion in the fund at this COP. But can we potentially get hundreds of millions? I think that's quite possible.
COP28 aims to instigate transformative actions, foster resilience, and secure financial backing to facilitate a just transition to renewable energy. And we'll see if by the end of these 2 weeks, we'll be closer to a more renewable future. Hipolito, Novelo, News 5, Dubai.
This reporting was delivered in partnership with the Commonwealth Foundation. Read more at commonwealthfoundation.com.